I'm Ulysses S. Grant, and today I am visiting with my old adversary, Pierre Gustave Toutant-Beauregard, the French Creole who, on the second day of Shiloh, or Pittsburgh Landing, became the commanding officer due to the death of General Albert Sidney Johnston on the afternoon of the first day of Shiloh. But I must first go back and give a bit of background. After the victories at Fort Donelson, I found myself not relieved of duty, but told by my commanding officer, General-in-Chief Henry Wager Halleck, to put Charles Ferguson Smith, General Charles Ferguson Smith, who had been my commandant of cadets when I was in the academy, in charge in command of the Army of the Tennessee and take it upriver to the south because the Tennessee River flows north in that part of the state, but take it south with intentions to link up in Corinth, Mississippi, with Don Carlos Buell, who was coming overland southwest from Columbia, Tennessee, and Nashville, Tennessee, to link his Army of the Ohio with my Army of the Tennessee. And we were going to have, when the two armies were combined, upwards of 80,000 men. With that juggernaut, we were going to march the 20 miles south from Pittsburgh Landing to Corinth, Mississippi, and take the crossroads of the Memphis and Charleston Railroad from Memphis to Charleston, South Carolina, the only railroad in the eastern United States that connected the Mississippi River with the Atlantic Ocean, and the North Railroad, the Mobile and Ohio, which ran from Mobile, Alabama, and terminated in Columbus, Kentucky. Now, it was originally intended to go to Columbus, Ohio, but I think they ran out of money at Columbus, Kentucky, which is on the Mississippi north of Memphis. And apparently they thought one Columbus was as good as another, and they stopped it there. However, it did terminate on the Mississippi, so freight could go from the railroad or to the railroad off the river. Now, those 16 square feet of rails in Corinth, Mississippi, had become the most expensive and important real estate in America at that time because of the rapid movement of materiel and men. And the Confederates had it and determined to keep it. We wanted it and determined to get it. So the purpose of the Army of the Tennessee being at Pittsburgh Landing was to wait for Buell and march and take Corinth. Now, Sidney Johnston was in Corinth, Mississippi, and General Beauregard will address that shortly. And he had amassed just weeks after the loss of the army of Buckner and some 17,000 Confederate soldiers. From February the 16th to about, April the 1st, Johnston had been able to get together some 44,000 troops, which is astonishing that he could get that many men together that soon after the loss of an army. And he wanted to advance on me because he was stung since Fort Donelson had been given up essentially without a fight after we going in to capture it. And there were cries for Johnston's head. Also, Johnston wanted to move on me while I still had just about 40,000 men before Don Carlos Buell joined with me, and we had about 80,000 men. And I'll address that in a moment. So when I got to Savannah, I met with General Smith and went down to Corinth to Pittsburgh Landing and met with my troops there. Sherman was in command on the field and began training my troops because many of those troops, some of them were combat veterans, had seen the elephant, but not very many of them. The vast majority had never fired a shot in anger, nor had a shot fired at them. And there were two things I did not do. I did not dig in, entrench, and I did not build breastworks. Now, I've been since that battle severely criticized because I didn't dig in nor build breastworks. But let me explain why I did not do either, and I do not regret not having done either. First of all, the war on April the 6th was only 51 weeks old. Remember the firing on Fort Sumter on April the 12th of 61 by actually General Beauregard. And this is now April. When I got there, it was March the 17th. So the war is only 11 months in progress. There had never been a battle before then or at that time of the size and cataclysmic battle and fighting as was Shiloh. Men at that time, as I said, most of my men had never been under fire. And at that time, the men were imbued still with real men don't dig holes to hide in. A real man fires on the enemy and stands and takes a return fire. Yes, sir, that's what a real soldier does. I'll have nothing with hiding in a hole. Uh, I will say at this time that after 2 days at Shiloh, there wasn't a single man of the nearly 100,000 who fought in the Battle of Shiloh who ever again in the war ever had any problem with digging a hole to hide in or standing behind a friendly tree. But before the battle, they still had what a real soldier does. And I felt that having them entrench or build breastworks would be perceived, and it was felt by my staff, that it would be damaging to the morale of the men, that the men would consider it showing the white feather, showing cowardice. So I did not dig in, nor did I entrench. If I had entrenched, Colonel McPherson, my engineer, said that the lines would have to be so far back close to the Tennessee River that most of the Army would be outside or west of the lines of the entrenchments anyway. So I agree with him. We agreed not to dig in. And building the breastworks, I felt that my men were more in need of the manual of arms and how to load and fire that weapon than spending time with the pick and the spade. So I did not dig in, nor did I entrench, and we were busily training. During the day, I would spend the day, I'd go upriver from Savannah to Pittsburgh Landing and supervise the training of the troops. At the end of the day, I'd get back on my boat, the Tigris, go back that 9 miles north downriver, and headquarter at the Cherry Mansion, waiting for Don Carlos Buell. Now, Don Carlos Buell was dragging his sword. He was in no hurry to get to join me because when he joined me, he was going to be under my command. Now, General Buell had outranked me in the old Army before the war, and he felt that he should still outrank me. And it disturbed him, irked him that he would be under my command. So he was in no hurry to get to me. Now, while I'm training my troops and not digging in or building breastworks, another reason I didn't do those was because military thinking will tell you, standard military thinking is that it takes 4 men to assault a fixed position for every 1 man that is behind that fixed position. And I was not going to try a frontal assault on what I knew to be a heavily dug in position at the crossroads. I also thought that Sidney Johnston, also a graduate of West Point and a distinguished commanding officer in the old Army, would be in sync with military thinking and not leave a heavily entrenched position to give me battle in the open. That would have been military madness to do so. So I was confident that General Johnston would not come to me. However, General Johnston had another agenda, of which he did not bother to inform me, and he had decided to attack me, as I said earlier, before Buell joined me, and we had an 80,000 man army. Now, I understand that General Johnston, who now had General Beauregard and General Bragg and General Hardee and General Breckinridge, the Confederate command at the Battle of Shiloh reads like a who's who in American military history. And Pierre Beauregard, or Gus, I think as his intimates call him, I don't think he considers me an intimate, but General Beauregard was also there, and who was regarded as something, I think it was already being called the Napoleon in gray. But General Beauregard, as he is about to explain to you, loomed large in that battle. General Beauregard, what say you?
Bonjour, mon general. How are you doing today? As General Grant stated, to understand this full battle in its huge dynamics and scale, because the general pointed out that this battle was actually two battles. It was what happened on the first day, and then the second day was actually a total reversal of things. It was actually my plan in reverse, in a sense. But let's go back to about January of 1862. In January of 1862, I had just received orders to move my headquarters to the Western Theater to be up under General Albert Sidney Johnston's command. But before I made that move, I had just received a throat surgery and was told that it is the most poorest time and poorest conditions to be transferring my flag to the West because of my health. So from January until April, many of my subordinates thought that I was actually on my deathbed. As I reviewed the lines that General Johnston has been placed in command of, some 700 miles that had to be defended, he asked me for my recommendations. And I got the feeling that Johnston thought I was being sent west to be his replacement. Johnston's star was starting to fall, and he began to realize that he must win a major victory to get back in good graces with the people of Tennessee and the Confederate Congress. At this time, we looked at a map at our defenses, and I basically tried to persuade the general we must concentrate the army. We cannot defend some 700 miles and spread our forces thin. So he said, General, where do you think the weakest link is on this map? And I made the recommendation that it was Fort Henry and Donelson. If Fort Henry's and Donelson fall, then you have the Tennessee River that goes straight down into the heart of the Confederacy. And I would hope that that would not take place, because at that time the Confederacy was a shell, that a federal fleet could come straight down the Tennessee River, go past Muscle Shoals, Alabama, even further. And there was no defenses there. So we could say that Fort Henry and Donelson was a key strategic spot that must be held. And from my understanding, Sam Grant was assigned after he presented his plan to General Halleck to take those positions. Johnston asked me, what should we do? I said, General, send the entire army to Donelson and Henry. At all costs, they must be held. We must control those rivers. Instead, General Johnston only sent 17,000 men to reinforce the garrison there. And then after a long engagement, and there was an opportunity for those forces to get out, Sam Grant would bottle them up and force the surrender of what would be the first Confederate forces to surrender to the Federals at that time. As a result, that caused our defensive lines to fall back from the Kentucky state border all the way down to what's going to be called the Nashville defensive line and go straight across the middle of Tennessee to Memphis to the river. As a result, even though I was in bad health, I was using my reputation to organize an army for General Johnson. Johnson asked me, where will this army be based? And I suggested Corinth, Mississippi, because of the vital railroads there. It was good for gathering supplies, shipping troops in, and material. Johnston, after realizing that Nashville was being threatened by Don Carlos Buell's army, decided to pull back. And this will be the first of the Confederate capitals to fall up under federal hands. It was a huge blow to us because Nashville was a huge warehouse of supplies and material for the Confederate military at that time. Of course, huge foodstuff storehouses there and factories at the time, especially gunpowder that was being produced there. But I digress. Let's move on with our story. At Corinth, I was gathering an army as General Johnson was moving forth from Nashville to Corinth. And by the time his forces get there, we have gathered some 48,000 men. Of course, Corinth being a vital spot, we were digging in and creating entrenchments and earthworks to defend the city as well. It is sometime in March that we're hearing reports that Sam Grant is moving on Pittsburgh Landing. And General Johnston asked me, says, General, we have an opportunity here. And he asked me to devise a plan of attack. Of course, from my bed, as I was in that sickened state, I was coughing up blood. A lot of people thought that this was probably my deathbed. But I relayed my plans, my thoughts of attack to my chief of staff, who was drawing them out, and he knew my mindset about Napoleonic tactics at that time. Sometime in late March, just before April, we met with General Johnson, and Johnson became very concerned about me when he saw that I was laying in bed coughing up blood. I waved at my chief of staff to explain the order of attack. And the plan, in a simple way of putting it, was to separate Sam Grant from the Tennessee River and then push him up against the Owl and Lick Creeks. If we did that, we could cut off his line of retreat, his line of supply, his line of communication, and push him into the bayous and the swamps there, the Owl and Lick Creeks, and he would have no choice but to surrender. My other fear was that this attack needed to be carried out as soon as possible. Reports were coming in to me about Don Carlos Buell moving from Nashville, and he did have a case of the slows, and I saw an opportunity here. I ordered the order of line of march to start off with General Bragg to lead off to head toward Pittsburgh Landing, where we found out that Grant was there and they were encamped there and they were training. It seemed from our scouting reports that he had no idea that we was about to do a general assault upon him. Knowing Grant, he probably would have thought that we would have followed the rules of war and waited for him to throw his forces upon our defenses. But I convinced General Johnston that we must seize this opportunity here, take him in the field, out in the open, where our army could do the most damage. On April the 4th, we began to move out from Corinth. And it was what should have taken us a few hours maybe a half a day to travel from Corinth to Shiloh to get in line of battle. Took us actually 2 days. It was raining. The men only had about 3 days worth of rations. We did not anticipate the march to take that long. The roads were horrible. Moving wagon and cannon through such horrendous conditions that were muddied, and as troops went through and wagons went through, it just made the roads a quagmire. But by April the 6th, we were in position. I met with General Johnson for one last war council. His thoughts as he polled his commanders, he asked me what I thought about opening up the attack. And at that time, I was convinced that the Federals knew that we were here. Green troops, you could say. Some of them were excited. Some of them were shooting muskets. There were shots being fired along the picket lines. I knew that the element of surprise was lost. But the engagement was on. At 4:30 in the morning, our line struck, and I saw my courage renew. My energy came back. My sickness was put to the side. The battle was on. General Johnston asked me to remain behind the lines to relegate troops to where they needed. This was the job of a commanding general, whereas Johnston was out on the field, out in the open. We struck with complete surprise. In fact, reports got back to me that Sherman was out on the field observing what he thought was just maybe a picket engagement, a skirmish along the lines, a probe of sort. He actually raised his hand as he was talking to his aide, and as a bullet whizzed by and struck his aide and killed him, he said, my God, we're under attack. Our boys went through Sherman's division. In just a matter of a few hours, we had occupied Sherman's division, and many of the men were eating the breakfast that the Federals had cooked that morning. They were still hot. This is indication of a great surprise we had pushed upon them. Johnston had rode out ahead to, in a sense, encourage his men to keep on the attack, press on, press on. And he picked up a cup and he said, this is my spoils of war, men. We must press on. I sent letters, messages to General Johnson. Remember, we must cut off Grant from the river. At this time, Johnson was pressing on, but eventually he became so stalled by the Federal center that he became so focused on it, like his blood was up. I sent messages to him, says, General, bypass that center. We must reach the river before Grant has an opportunity to set up a defensive line. And it is during those attacks upon the Federal center that was holding that Johnson met his death. He was leading the men by regiment, piecemeal, into what becomes known as the Hornet's Nest. And a bullet had struck him behind the knee. And he did not even know that he had been struck. And as he began to bleed to death into his boot, he fell from his horse, and his aides helped him to a tree. And there he bled out. And the sad thing about it is that just before this incident took place, Johnson had sent his own personal doctor back to the behind the lines to tend to the wounded. If only his doctor had stayed there with a tourniquet, they could have stopped this travesty from happening. I received word that Johnston has been lost as I was there at the Shiloh church, and now find myself in command. I called for an all-out general assault after I had gathered and amassed 62 guns, what will become known as Ruggles Battery. We opened fire upon the center to finally clear them out. It was said that those cannons could be heard all the way to Corinth, some 20 miles away. An all-out general assault was ordered, and I ordered the line to move forward, press on, men. The center fell. Some 5,000 Federals were captured or wounded or killed there in that center. But to my anger, my anguish, my frustration, it seems that that center that Johnston focused on allowed Grant to have that opportunity to create that line of defense, what I feared. Reports were coming in to me that the road to the right on Grant's flank was still open. General Chalmers and his Mississippi Brigade set out to probe that area to see if it could be assaulted, to take advantage of this opening along that river road. He was met with extreme firepower. Heavy casualties were taken. Some people will criticize me for not exploiting that road enough. But if you're there to see the topography of that land, it is nothing but woods and valleys and ravines that even if I had moved the entire army to the right, going into those valleys, Grant could use a token force at the top of those ravines and held us off. On top of that, the Federal Navy was shelling us from the river right there on the river road. I began to realize that nightfall was coming upon us, and I called a halt. I said, we need to reorganize our lines. Men were confused about where their commanders were, their brigades were. Regiments in one brigade was intermingled with another. An all-out reorganization of my lines needed to be done. Plus, the men were exhausted. Remember, they had 3 days rations, and they ate those on the march to Shiloh. So the men were hungry. They were tired. Ordnance needed to be brought back up to the front to replenish the guns. Men needed to be resupplied with ammunition. And plus, it was becoming nightfall. And as a result, as you know well, no battle has ever been successful fighting at night in the 19th century. That night, the rains came, lightning came. It was such a horrendous sight and smell and sound. The Federals shelled us. And there during the night, it seemed like the angel of death was coming down, reaping up the souls of the men that had lost their lives that day. You could hear the men on the battlefield at night screaming for God, for Mother, saying their prayers. Horses were crying out in the night. And a report came in as I came out of my tent and looked across the battlefield. You could see an eerie glow over the bodies of the men. And it looked like the Valkyries had come down to take these warrior souls to Valhalla. That night, the Federal Navy continued their shelling, and Grant's line continued their shelling. Our men tried their best to get their rest because I knew we could finish this job the next day. Now I think I'll let General Grant pick up from there and let you know what was going on through his mind on that first day in preparations of the second day.
Thank you, General. Before I elaborate any further, I would have you know that the surprise wasn't exactly as General Beauregard would have you think. Uh, but I'll elaborate on that. We'd been hearing rebel gunfire. For the fourth, the fifth, uh, and we knew that they were out there. Now I thought it was a reconnaissance, perhaps a reconnaissance in force. Now, just like I had predominance of green troops, so did General Johnston. They hadn't seen, most of his men had not seen the elephant, as I understand. And for them, as for my troops, my men, war was still a lark. And they were shooting their guns to be sure their powder was dry. There were even, I have sentries, pickets that reported even hearing the bands play out there. They were not making any secret of their presence. I just thought it was a reconnaissance in force, and I was still in firm belief that Johnson would not leave a heavily fortified position. Now, I had also on Friday night, the 4th, had an accident when my horse fell on me in the dark at Pittsburgh Landing and nearly crushed my left leg. So while no bones were broken, I was on a crutch for Friday evening and all day Saturday and into the morning of Sunday morning. And in fact, wearing a slipper, house slipper on my left foot because the swelling was too great to get a boot on. And I was having breakfast with my staff there in the Cherry Mansion, and I heard that dull thud roar of what I knew to be artillery, and it caught me in mid-sip, and I cocked my head and listened because the dining room is on the back of the Cherry Mansion overlooking the river on that right back side. So if you ever visit the Cherry Mansion, go around to the home. It's privately owned at the time still, but the back of the house on its left back is where the dining room is. And I set my coffee cup down and said, "Gentlemen, the ball is in motion." Now, Captain Gwynn of the Tigris had kept up steam, so there was a good bit of scurrying and hustling, and I was carried down the three steps, landings of the ground to get to the steamboat, and we were off. I put my crutch between my leg and the saddle and the horse, rather, and I fought the Battle of Shiloh with the crutch and my left foot in the house shoe. First significant point we passed was just a little bit south of Savannah, Tennessee, Crump's Landing. That's where I had my supplies built up. And I thought, indeed, if the Confederates were to attack us at all, they would attack us at our supply depot. I had General Lew Wallace and some 5,000, 5,500 men there. And I had my boat go in, Captain Gwynn take the Tigris in, and I hallooed to Wallace, and we came very close. I could talk to him, and I said, "Get your men in position and come by the nearest road," which I meant to be the river road, which ran parallel to the river. General Wallace thought it meant the new road that they had cut, which ran away from the river and came in south of where the battle was and come in behind the Confederate forces. And then I moved on. When I got to Pittsburgh Landing, 8:30, 9 o'clock or so, General Buell was there. I was nonplussed at this because I found out that Buell had indeed gotten to Savannah the night before. He had orders to report to me, and he did not deign to do so. So he had come down the river. The bulk of his forces were still back at Savannah. Now, Bull Nelson had been an advance contingent for his troops, and asked me where the day before, where did I want him to be? And I said, "You can go into camp. There's no hurry." Nelson had a premonition. He said, I don't want to go into camp. He went ahead and marched down the Tennessee riverbank and was opposite Pittsburgh Landing on the east side of the bank. And he was in place when I got to Pittsburgh Landing. General Buell, when he saw me, met me, we conversed briefly. And he asked me, even at that early date, he said, General, what are your plans to retreat? And I was astonished. And I looked at him and I said, well, General, I haven't despaired of whipping the rebels yet. I have no retreat plan. And I put my spurs to the horse and rode up the bank. Now, the scene at the riverbank, Pittsburgh Landing, is where the hills around Pittsburgh Landing plunge down and level out at the river. You may visit it to this day, visit the battlefield. And General Beauregard and I both urge you to do so, so you may stand which I am speaking right now. The landing with the hills coming down were a swarm with federal troops that had bolted and run. And they had got that far, and they couldn't, because they couldn't go any further, they hit the river. And indeed, when Buell began unloading troops, he had to fight off my troops trying to get on the boat to escape. Now, Buell, being a professional officer and not willing to deal with volunteers, never understood the volunteer mind. And he threatened, he said, I'm going to turn the guns on you and fire cannon at you. I'll shoot you where you lie. And I turned to him, I said, General Buell, they're good men. They're just scared. Now, when they get over being scared, they'll go back and take their positions in the line and be the good soldiers that I know that they can be. And indeed, ultimately, they all did. But General Buell was hitting them with the flat of his sword and cursing them and threatening to kill them while he's bringing his troops over. I immediately ordered that ammunition be sent to the front. I was asked, where do we take them? And I said, go to where the fighting and the firing is the heaviest and take the crates of ammunition there. That's where they'll be needed. Being an old quartermaster, I knew that was necessary. Don't wait till somebody needs ammunition, have it available for them. And I began to go and visit the commanding officers, everyone I could find. I went from the north at Lick Creek all the way down to the south where my line was anchored on the Tennessee River, several miles. And I visited that day every commanding officer on the field. And I feel I visited with all of them. Two reasons. I wanted to see for myself what was happening, and I wanted the men to see me, that I was suffering the same exposure and battle as were they, which I think heartened them. Now, when Beauregard's men or Johnston's troops, that first wave of three, that was some 3 miles long, they're about 1,500 yards apart, I think, in three waves. They did hit Sherman there near the log meeting house. It became the center of our line. And the line buckled back north and south, but the most intense fighting took place there at Sherman's headquarters at the log home. McCluney was just behind him and to his left, to Beauregard's Johnston's right. And they pushed us back. Now, nobody was caught in their nightshirt asleep in their tent. In fact, there were a number of regiments that they heard the gunfire, got the word that rebels were attacking, and actually got in formation on the field. Some of them did. Now, we were pushed back. I will spare you at this time a lengthy account of what happened. But what General Beauregard is true, but it took them all day to push us from the log meeting house some 2 miles back to the Tennessee River. And it was savage fighting inch for inch. And immediately after the battle, I praised the Confederate soldier. In fact, in my after battle thinking, there were 3 points of significance that I need to tell you that I thought. Now, after Shiloh, even after the first day, but particularly after the battle, I knew this was not going to be a 90-day war. Obviously, it was already 11 months old, nearly a year. I knew that it was not going to be a bloodless affair. I felt that it was going to be a long and bloody war that was going to be fought until one side or the other, holding principles so dear as unto death, was going to have to yield those principles to the other side. Now, my feelings were, first of all, that the Confederates hit us as hard as they could. 3 lines of 44,000, as I understand. General Beauregard said 48,000, and they hit us with the most men that they could garner, and we held. We were able the second day to push them back. The other feature for me is that they held us with the best leadership that they attacked us with the best that they had. As I said earlier, the Confederate command staff at Pittsburgh Landing reads like a who's who in American military history. They had the cream of their crop, and we still prevailed. And the third reason, the point that I would lift up, is they hit us as hard as they could. In fact, in my after battle thinking, I said the Confederate soldier hurled himself at our positions, particularly on the first day, with no apparent concern for their own well being. The Confederate soldier proved himself to be a worthy opponent. It wasn't going to be one Yankee can lick 10 Rebs. As they found out that one Reb wasn't going to lick 10 Yankees, but they hit us with the most they had, the hardest that they could hit us with the best leadership, and still we were able the second day to push them back, as General Beauregard has said, in a diametric opposite of the first day. But it took them all day to push us back to the Tennessee River. We were standing with our boots almost in the water. Nightfall was coming. Now, I had sent Colonel Webster to set up, pull all the artillery that he could and put it on the road leading to Pittsburgh Landing. And in fact, that road, which became famous as my last line of defense, is still there this day. In fact, there are some 4 pieces of heavy artillery that were actually fired in the battle that are still there to this day. They were too heavy to pull off. I said, leave them there. Now, they pushed us back. And what General Beauregard has not said, and it was not an intentional omission on General Beauregard's part, but I should like to point out to you that with our last line of defense, I believe it was General James Chalmers who was on the opposite side of the line. There is I think it's Dill Creek that was running between our lines, and it's 30 feet deep. And it was filled with all of that rain General Beauregard referred to for the last week. So not only did we have a formidable last line of artillery, but we also had, or General Chalmers of the Confederacy had a very deep water-filled creek between him and our lines. So General Chalmers, wisely so, and under orders, felt it better to wait until the next day. Now, General Wallace, much like Moses in the wilderness, wandered about and finally made it just before dark. His men, his 5,500 men, did not participate in the first day's battle. And as nightfall fell, Buell's men began to unload. Now, they got 3 regiments across the river during the day. Those were the on 2, 3, I think the 76th Indiana was the primary presence, and they had, I think, 2 men wounded and 1 man killed. Now, General Buell would have you know that the Army of the Ohio, saved the Army of the Tennessee. I will tell you this. In the first day's fighting, the Army of the Tennessee suffered more than 7,000 casualties, killed and wounded. The Army of the Ohio suffered 3 killed and wounded. And they didn't get there until almost the end of the day. So you decide for yourself if we were saved by the Army of the Ohio. He moved his men, thanks to the Navy, all night long and moved some 20 to 25,000 men across to our side of the battlefield overnight. Now, it began pouring rain almost about dark. The sun went down and the rain came down, and the battle stopped for the evening. In that driving rain, I had gone back to the trading post there on the banks of the river, and where I had my headquarters, and went in, and the surgeons had taken it over as a field hospital. And already the pile of arms and legs had reached up to the windows and passed. And I couldn't stand that horror, and decided that I'd rather subject myself to the elements than to witness that horror. Went back out in the driving rain and got a lantern set under a tree. About midnight, Sherman, like an apparition, appears out of that driving rain. My cigar's dead and cold. And he walks up to me and he said, "Grant, we've had the devil's own day today." And I took that soggy cigar out of my mouth and I said, "Yes, we have. Lick 'em tomorrow, though." Put the cigar back in my mouth, and I was holding that lantern up to illuminate between us. Sherman, after a pause, which I thought unusual, clears his throat and he said, "Well, I need to get back to my command." And I said, "Best you do. Have the men sleep on their arms, and remember what I told you at Donelson. There is a time in every battle when both sides think that they are defeated. And it's at that moment that the side that attacks first will carry the day. It is so here. And Beauregard is going to have to get up mighty early in the morning to hit me before I hit him." And Sherman saluted, disappeared, just dematerialized into the driving rain. Now, the Navy, the Lexington and the Tyler gunboats were lobbing shells every 15 minutes and into the Confederate forces. They also kept us awake, but that didn't keep any of those men awake. They were exhausted. They'd been fighting all day. We also got the 20,000 fresh troops, and Beauregard had not gotten any. And yes, I'd been told Beauregard was in command now. At the first light, we moved up, pickets spread out, and we engaged again. And the fighting was every bit as savage as it had been the day before. I will say again, the Confederate soldier acquitted himself as more than a worthy foe. And you must also keep in mind, most of the men in both armies had never seen the elephant. Shiloh was more or less two civilian mobs brawling. Yet both sides maintained superb military discipline and stood and held their ground against the enemy in the face of withering, blistering fire. Both sides are to be commended. But we pushed the Confederate forces grudgingly. They gave inch for inch just as slowly and dearly as we had the day before. And then we pushed them back past the log meeting house and further back toward Fraley's Field, where the battle had begun the day before. And it is there that General Beauregard needs to take up the narrative and tell what was happening in his command and what his own staff was telling him at that time.
Thank you, General. That night at the end of the first day, I was riding up and down the lines, trying to make sure that our lines were being reorganized, that men were being given the ordnance and the supplies they needed, to find out who exactly was in command in the different areas, and trying to make sure that we were prepared to continue the battle on the next day. I had sent a report to His Excellency President Davis, assuring him that we would win on the second day, that it was practically a victory as it was. I also wanted to inform him of the death of Johnston, because Johnson was, in a sense, like a father figure, a surrogate brother to him, and Davis thought highly of Johnson. As the morning approached from a sleepless night and the horrors of the first day, men were coming rushing through the lines, letting us know that Buell was attacking. Buell was attacking. Grant said that Buell did not help him on the first day. I agree. But he'll also disagree with me that it was Buell that helped him win the second day. Because without those reinforcements, without those fresh troops, maybe we would have had a better chance. Who knows? Who knows? We were still evenly matched until those reinforcements came across. I couldn't believe it that Buell had crossed over, because the reports I had received that Buell was still a day away. Unfortunately, the reconnaissance cavalry that was out monitoring Buell was looking at the rear guard instead of the vanguard of Buell. Buell's vanguard had reached that night at the end of the first day. So in my mind, that's the difference of the battle. Fresh troops upon the field. My men are still trying to recover from the first day. I think General Grant said it best. It was like two mobs fighting each other. We were giving back what they were giving us, and vice versa. It got so close that it was hand to hand. Men were shooting into each other's faces. It was a bloodbath. It was horrific. I have been in many battles from the Aztec War, and then, of course, at the beginning of the war here. But nothing could compare to the savagery that took place on the first and second days of Shiloh. And I think Sam said it best, that the second day was the same as the first day, only in reverse. He did take advantage of the first light. He made sure that he got in his first shot before I could. And after several hours, by mid-afternoon, my aides were coming to me saying that, General, we must withdraw. I did not want to hear this. I forbidden it. But by 2 o'clock, I began to realize that, yes, I must keep the army intact, and we must do a withdrawal from the field. We slowly but surely began to fall back to Corinth. I ordered Colonel Forrest and his cavalry to do a rear guard action for us as we began to withdraw from the field. I tried to make sure that the wounded got off the field first, as our men covered this long line of wagons taking the wounded back to Corinth and taking ammunition and arms that we had captured from the Federals on the first day. We also had to do something with the Federal prisoners that we had captured from the first day that made up the center of the line. So we had to parole them so that our army could leave. The roads, once again, were just as bad as they were coming up. They were muddy. They were a quagmire. Guns were sinking in the mud up to the hubs of the wheels. Men were struggling. But you have to give credit to my boys. Yes, it was a withdrawal, but it was not a rout. They withdrew back to Corinth in good fashion and in good order. And Colonel Forrest was doing his best to cover our withdrawal from the field. Let me say this, it was not a rout. It was not a disorganized retreat. It was an orderly withdrawal, and the army stayed intact. My idea was to pull back to Corinth and hopefully allow Grant to pursue me, to throw his forces upon the lines. At that time, Colonel Forrest was doing his best. And I think General Grant will attest to this later. Forrest was giving what he got at a place called Fallen Timbers, just between Corinth and Shiloh. And as reports were coming in, whether it is myth, whether it was reality, it was stated that Forrest saw General Sherman upon the field. And he had leveled his pistol at the general. And when he fired, he had already emptied his chambers. And Sherman was saved that day because of an empty pistol that Forrest had. Forrest withdrew his men, and I will let General Grant give an assessment of that rear guard action, because I think he needs to tell you from the reports of what Sherman had to say. But before I turn it back over to General Grant, I would like to say that once we got back into Corinth, immediately I began assessing the situation. I began to immediately rebuild the army. Forces up under Van Dorn and Price, who were supposed to be with us at Shiloh, but were several days late. They had now entered Corinth. And what was a 48,000 man army when we marched out to Shiloh? I have rebuilt it to around 65,000 men. And I am begging Grant, throw his men against our parapets. It will be a bloodbath. And I think now is the time that I need to turn it over to General Grant to give his assessment of the last day of battle. General?
Thank you, General Beauregard. The second day, we did have those 25,000 fresh troops, and they were of tremendous benefit. I have said that the Battle of Shiloh was won before Buell ever put boot on the west side of the Mississippi River, and I still firmly believe that. But the Army of the Ohio, that additional 25,000 men, certainly made a significant difference, because we had fresh troops that had an army of fresh troops that had not fired a shot, and General Beauregard had had no reinforcements. We engaged at first light, and the Confederates grudgingly gave ground. I understand that one of General Beauregard's staff had even turned to him during the falling back, and it was an orderly falling back. It was never a rout. Nobody ran. But one of his staff officers turned to him and turned in the saddle and said, "General Beauregard, do you not see our army being much like a sugar cube that's had a drop of water put on it? It is holding its shape, but it is dissolving away." And at that time, I understand General Beauregard accepted the inevitability and said, yes, order the retreat. They fell back from the battlefield. There was no exultancy on our part. We were glad for them to fall back. Now, I had to ascertain if it was a regrouping for a counterattack, or if they were indeed vacating the field, and I sent Sherman. Sherman met them at Fallen Timbers, And there was this Colonel Bedford Forrest who had escaped from Fort Donelson, I found out. In fact, he led upwards of 1,000 men out of Fort Donelson to live to fight another day, and fight he did. And they met on the same field, and I too have heard that information. In fact, I heard it from my side that General Sherman had leveled his revolver at Forrest, but that Forrest had fired and it fell on an empty chamber. But even if it's not true, that's a great story. But we do know that Sherman and Forrest were face to face, in essence, on the same field one time during the war. Now, Sherman fell back and came to me and assured me it is not a gathering for a counterattack. They are retreating. Now, at that time, I could have ordered General Buell with his fresh troops from the Army of the Ohio to pursue Beauregard, but I still was not comfortable with ordering the man who had, before the war, been senior to me, now junior to me, and I hadn't been in that position very long. I was still sensitive about ordering Buell, who is now my junior, to be in pursuit of Beauregard. Moreover, I think General Sherman articulated it very well. He said, we had just enjoyed 2 days of their Southern hospitality and had had quite enough. And our feeling was that if you will leave us alone, we will leave you alone. And we left them alone. I've been severely criticized that I didn't pursue him. Had it been later in the war, I would have pursued him, but I did not. My troops were exhausted and his troops were, but they were moving away. I wanted to assess my position on the battlefield and take the numbers of my dead and wounded, and I too reorganize and be prepared for what I felt could well be a counterattack, certainly to prepare for movement on Corinth. Now, earlier I referred to General Halleck as General in Chief. General Halleck at that time was not General in Chief. It wasn't until July that he was named General in Chief to replace George McClellan, who was, during the Battle of Shiloh, the General in Chief. So at the end of the day on April the 7th, April 6th and 7th, end of day, April 7th, the Battle of Shiloh came to an end. 100,000 men had been involved in a clash that covered about 30 square miles of land. It was the largest battle that had ever been fought to that time on the North American continent. And the gates of hell had swung open for 2 days, and the blast of fire and brimstone had inundated the men of two armies. It's been said that after the South, after Shiloh, nobody in the South smiled. Well, I will tell you, after the Battle of Shiloh, nobody up north smiled either. We knew that we were in, I felt, given those three issues that I've already enumerated, I felt that even though we had prevailed, we would prevail ultimately, and that we needed to settle in for a long war. When the casualty list spread across the country, when the shadow of death spread across the country like an ink blot, there was weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth. My God, what have we done? Because the people back home got a good mouthful of what war was. But it was too late. Cooler heads had not been listened to, and the god of war had to step in. Someone had said warfare is politics that have failed. And it had. And we fought the Battle of Shiloh, the first major battle of the war. Federals prevailed, but I knew that Beauregard had fallen back to Corinth to prepare both for my charge that he felt would come, and certainly to look forward into the future to defend the South. And there, I think the tale of Shiloh, Pittsburgh Landing, can come to an end. Now, I think we, General, have said quite enough, and we must needs bring our conversation and description of our experience, our meeting at Shiloh, to a close. It has been good to see you again, my former adversary. I hope our paths cross again in friendlier terms soon and often. What say you, General?
Come down and see me in New Orleans sometimes, General. I'll teach you to the local cuisine.
I should look forward to it, General.
Take
Thank you.
care, General.